I, at first, approached the album making being like, there must be a thread, you know, there has to be a common theme. But I actually learnt that the themes almost become apparent at the end. So just focusing on doing one song at a time makes the idea of making an album feel a little bit less daunting.
Some of these folks wanna make you cry.
Hi, I'm Arlo Parks, and this is my NME track by track for Collapsed in Sunbeams. Collapsed in sunbeams, stretched out open to beauty, however brief or violent. I see myself ablaze with joy, sleepy-eyed, feeding your cat or slicing. So Collapsed in Sunbeams is the first piece on the album, and it's based off a poem that I read when I was a little bit younger. It's called 4 Poems for Robin by Gary Snyder. And I wanted something that included all these different vignettes and almost flashing portraits of flowers and joy and pain and healing. I wanted it to feel almost like this. I wanted it to feel like almost the different universe of the emotions that are going to be explored in the album. And to me, it was very important to have this kind of visual and sensory element to the introduction to the album. And I wrote it at home, I believe, actually in my bedroom, where I started writing tunes, and I produced it by myself just on my computer.
I know you can't let go of anything at the moment. Just know it won't hurt so much forever. It won't hurt so much.
Hurt was an interesting one because it's the song that I wrote after I'd had this kind of period of writer's block, where I was trying to figure out what was the message that I wanted for this album. What was the kind of sonic palette? I think I'd spent quite a lot of time overthinking the idea of an album, and this song just came out completely organically. It was basically an emotional outpouring. I wrote this in an Airbnb in Dalston with Luca, and I'd been listening to a lot of DJ Shadow, and there's this song called Changeling that has these really like crunchy drums, and I was also listening to a lot of Motown, a lot of old school soul, so like Minnie Riperton, Otis Redding. So I wanted something that felt kind of warm, and I wanted to explore the theme of grief and of healing and of the possibility for, you know, feeling joy. I think when you're in those low moments, you often feel like pain is forever, but there's this quote by Audre Lorde that says pain will either change or end. That was the kind of crux of it. And I wanted to tell it from the point of view of observing a character, and it's actually about a friend of mine who I love very much. And it was, yeah, almost like an homage to the idea of hope and of things kind of looking up in the end.
I think you know it, too cool to show it. Baby, so good, you're too good to be true. I think you know it, too cool.
Too Good was written with Paul Epworth. We recorded it in Church Studios, which is an amazing experience in itself when you think about all the people that have passed through there. And we had such a wide range of influences for this song. Everything from Cleo Soul and Inflow's production to kind of old Zambian psychedelic rock to Frank Ocean to Solange. We wanted basically to have this, wanted to pull from a million different places. We both have this interest in like sampling and of drums and synths. And this almost happened by accident, actually. So we went into the session, we were just kind of jamming, I was playing guitar and he was just fiddling around, and he pulled out this old kind of like drum machine, because I was always interested in like old analog gear, and just started kind of playing the drums in, and I was like, those drums sound so like thick and bassy, and it kind of reminded me of like old school 90s pop. But then I wanted to actually pull from a more singer-songwriter point of view in terms of the lyrics. So the lyrics were actually inspired by like Suzanne by Leonard Cohen and Nick Drake and Sufjan Stevens, and I wanted it to be a story, but I wanted to pick up on those really specific details. I think I was thinking almost about these old Polaroids that I'd seen of like these kids in the 70s, and the idea of, you know, touching a bump on your wrist you were born with, and of like buying someone breakfast and someone playing with their rings, that idea of like creating a very physical and sensory world in terms of the lyrics. And I wanted it to be something that people could dance to. I think I've always had this desire. I mean, my mum always says, she's like, maybe something I can dance to in the kitchen. So, you know, I came through, I guess, with this one. And it's one of my favorites, actually, because I feel like I pushed myself into that kind of pop world whilst retaining elements of, you know, producers like Neptunes and Timbaland who created those like iconic 90s pop tunes.
To talk the pleasure.
Hope is probably my favourite song on the album. It was written and recorded again in an Airbnb, there's a little trend here, in Hoxton, where we are now. And for me, the reason why this song is so important is because of that hook, because of that sentiment of like, you're not alone. The fact that everybody has their own individual scars, individual traumas, individual things that have hurt them or changed them throughout their lives. And I definitely think when you're a teenager as well, you go through those things like loss and heartbreak for the first time, so it feels even more kind of brutal and visceral when it does happen. But I just pictured people singing along to this at a show. You know, I pictured all these people like just kind of shouting like, you're not alone, and almost holding each other. That sense of like, of creating almost like a family. Or I wanted my music always to make people feel held, make people feel seen, especially people who are going through difficult times. I think there's a lot of shame surrounding things like mental health. And I wanted to have this almost like spoken word breakdown to kind of, I wanted it to feel quite like ethereal and otherworldly. And I wanted to almost be speaking to the listener for the first time as we go through the album. I wanted to be like directly addressing the person listening, especially if they were going through a hard time, and being like, know that I know. Like, know that I've also been through these difficult moments, but we'll get through it together.
Maybe if you took a breath, you would hear me when I talk to you. Through her necklace in his face, eyes so bright with disappointment.
So Caroline was inspired a lot by the streets, actually. It was inspired by the idea of telling a story in a way that seemed almost like you were relating a story to a friend. So I did actually observe this couple having this massive argument in House of Broadway, which is near where I live. And I wanted to explore the idea of something that was once so exciting and passionate and healthy dissolving. And I wanted to kind of shift the different perspectives from, you know, Caroline's partner to me watching it, to how she felt. And that sense of the chorus, I wanted it to almost be like an explosion of emotion. I wanted it to feel like the partner was actually just like shouting down the street, but then obviously I'm delivering those lines, so it creates that sense of surrealism. And this is actually, in terms of sonically, it was inspired by In Rainbows, which is my favourite album of all time, inspired by Weird Fishes and Reckoner. And I wanted those kind of glistening, glittering guitars to create this sense of, I know, this like gooiness and this expanse, even though I was talking about something very specific, one tiny moment that could probably have like defined those two people's lives.
I take a jump off the fire escape. To make the black.
So I believe that Black Dog is probably the second oldest song on this record. I wrote this song when I was still at school, at an Airbnb in Victoria, I believe this time. And for me, this song is probably one of the most heartbreaking and the most cathartic songs I've ever written. It was very inspired actually by Sylvia Plath's poetry and by Tom York's lyrics as well, on songs like Nude. And I wanted to create this very kind of intimate, small world. I wanted it to feel almost like a friend was playing the guitar to you in your room. And it's essentially about having somebody that you love being in a lot of pain and feeling almost helpless, wanting to save someone, which I guess is problematic in itself, but especially when you're young and you're seeing things like depression and anxiety in the people around you, there is that desire, you know, I would do anything to get you out of your room. And I think I was probably about 16 or 17 when the friend that I'm talking about kind of started feeling these things. But now she's doing a lot better, and we've been like writing letters to each other over lockdown, and we talk about this song and talk about the fact that, you know, how much we've grown, how the confidence that we've gained in ourselves, in our purpose, in our bodies. And I think for me, although it's such a heartbreaking song, it's almost a reminder of what I was talking about in Hurt, the fact that things change, things evolve, we move past pain. And of course, there's never going to be a point where, we'll be completely okay, because it's just part of being a human being. But the fact that, now we're 20 years old, and we're doing what we love and we're feeling like pretty uplifted and confident feels really positive. I think especially because the reaction to this song was during lockdown, during a time where there was this sense of chaos, and personally, I was kind of questioning the purpose of art and what my purpose and function was as a creative and even just as a human being, and the fact that people were saying, this helped open a conversation in my relationship or in my family that helped me get therapy, or this saved my marriage, or this helped my friend who was ill and who was feeling quite lost. It just feels completely heartwarming, and it makes me feel like I'm doing something that's having a real positive effect on people's lives, when I'm just kind of writing about my experiences and from my heart. So that felt really amazing.
So I know why we lasted 2 months. Could not hold my hand in public. Felt their eyes judging our love.
Green Eyes was written in the same few days that Hurt was written, in Dalston. And for this one, I was really inspired by Frank Ocean. I was inspired by Futura Free and Night and Ivy, and I wanted this sense of kind of summery nostalgia. It was quite inspired by films like Kiki's Delivery Service and Princess Mononoke, that kind of innocent Studio Ghibli energy, and the visual nature of it. I wanted dragon fruit and peaches and painting walls green. I wanted that sense of a summer when you're young and you have few responsibilities and you're basically just running around and kind of experiencing love and a heartbreak for the first time. So for me, it's a song about self-discovery, not even necessarily just in terms of my sexuality. It's more about, being an adolescent and having those first moments where you fall in love or you fall out of love or you learn to set boundaries, and also how the people around you perceive you and perceive your relationships. Just the idea of shining, of just allowing your light to just shine, because there's always going to be somebody who has a problem with what you're doing or who thinks you're not cool, or, and it's like, whatever, man, just do what you do.
Why don't you just go? Why don't you just go? Why don't you just go?
Just Go was it was my first foray into kind of slow, like disco vibes, because I was really into the kind of the New York, like no wave scene, and the idea of creating disco music that's like slightly less obvious, slightly more left. And it's inspired by actually this character, Hatsumi, in the book Norwegian Wood. And this idea of being with somebody who isn't treating you the way you deserve to be treated, and forgiving them, and finally getting to a point where you're just like kind of eliminating that toxic energy and not giving somebody another chance. And I think that's something that you grow to learn over time, growing to value your own happiness and not just staying with someone out of fear or because you're afraid to upset them. And I think for me, it's quite triumphant, Everyone has somebody in their life that, whether it's a friend or a partner who isn't treating them the way that they deserve to be treated. And for me, it was almost like, you don't have to keep this person in your life. It's your life and you deserve to be surrounded by positive energy. So just out they go. Just go.
It feels like nothing's changing and I can't do this, can't do this. It feels like nothing's changing and I can't do this.
So for Violet was very inspired actually by Kid A, by a song called Idiotech, and also by Dummy by Portishead. So it was really inspired by the song Roads. And this is actually like probably one of the most painful songs that I wrote, because it's about a friend of mine who had a really difficult time at home. I think it is actually an exploration of of hopelessness and of those darker moments. And I wanted to tell it in a way that felt very kind of frank and quite brutal. And I wanted to explore the more trip-hop electronic side of what I do. It's an exploration of the fact that everybody has their own personal traumas and the fact that, you know, just by looking at somebody, you can't necessarily know what they're going through at home or what they've been through. And it's the idea of trying to be there for somebody who is in a very dark and difficult place, and almost, I guess it's about innocence dissolving a little bit, because when you're exposed to those things, then it does, for better or for worse, kind of make you a little bit more aware of the world and of the pain in it.
Seeing you with him burns, I feel it deep in my throat. You put your hands in his shirt, you play him records I showed you, read him still.
Eugene was recorded actually in the same 24 hours that Black Dog was made. And for me, it was just about telling the story of these blurred lines between friendship and romance. And it actually, its reach expanded beyond anything I could ever have imagined. People were telling me that it actually helped them realize that they were in love with their best friend, which is incredible to me. And it's actually when I first fell in love with the idea of using those kind of ethereal, reverbed out guitars to create this sense of expanse and warmth. And sonically, it was inspired by a lot of things, but mainly by like Unknown Mortal Orchestra, and also by people like Aldous Harding and Alex G, because I wanted to tap into those very like idiosyncratic vocal deliveries as well. I wanted it to feel quite hushed, as if I was just kind of inviting a listener into my world. Bluish was actually a demo that I started in my bedroom. So I just kind of constructed that using Logic. I wanted the drums to kind of remind me of Cranes in the Sky by Solange, and the piano to have this kind of blood orange softness to it. And for me, this song is about the idea of a friend almost smothering you. That idea of having a lack of boundaries. There's that vocal chop at the beginning where it's, you held me so hard, I went bluish, I've resolved to set boundaries. And that's something that I think you learn as you grow older, the fact that, you know, if you let somebody become completely intertwined with you, then it means you almost grow into each other, and that is not necessarily healthy. And I wanted the lyrics to have this sense of like abstraction that I read in a lot of poems. I wanted it to feel quite sensory, but then have that repeat of the refrain, like I shouldn't have to ask you twice, almost like a mantra to remind me to set boundaries in the future.
Making rainbows out of something painful.
Portrait 400 was started again by me in my room. I found this sample, and I've always been obsessed with hip hop. You know, I've always been obsessed by tunes like Curls by MF Doom and people like Mos Def. I wanted the last track to almost, you could almost picture, you know, like the end credits to a movie like The Breakfast Club or something coming down. And it was inspired a lot by Just Kids and by Robert Mapplethorpe in particular, and by the music that was coming out at that time, things like Pale Blue Eyes by the Velvet Underground. And I wanted to explore the idea of substances and of people kind of relying on unhealthy behaviours to cope with difficult situations. But at the same time, you know, the idea of making rainbows out of something painful was one that reminded me that even in difficult times, even in painful times, you know, I've managed to kind of make art out of those difficult moments, and hopefully that's something that helps people and then makes them feel safe and comforted in a way. Honestly, I don't really think about the track listing. I try and approach, this is my first album, so I say I try, but that time I tried to approach each song as its own individual piece. Even though I was, of course, aware of the idea of cohesion, I think that's why there's such like a broad palette in terms of how the songs sound. Because I, at first, approached the album making being like, there must be a thread, you know, there has to be a common theme. But I actually learnt that the themes almost become apparent at the end. So just focusing on doing one song at a time makes the idea of making an album feel a little bit less daunting. And it's more fun, you know, you can approach everything differently.